debate. The honourable member for Fort McMurray Cold Lake, and I will have to interrupt at about 6:42.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to acknowledge that I'm disappointed that we are here today discussing this privilege motion, which has effectively paralyzed Parliament because the Liberal government refuses to give up unredacted documents because they are afraid of what those say. And frankly, they're fully aware of what those documents say, and if they were not concerned about the content of the document, they would have allowed us to resume the work of the House many, many days ago, and they would have kept a consistent story. And it's been quite interesting, actually, how many different stories we've heard from this government on this. But I'm going to go to something that I had a really cool conversation this summer with someone, and they explained to me that they were a business owner and they have a couple different businesses, and there was some complications, and they had a family member that got sick, and so through their family member getting sick, they decided that they were going to hire an employee to handle a bunch of the books, which they hired someone that they'd already had on staff and that they thought they could trust because they were actually a family friend. And through the course of more than a year of employment, this family friend that was an employee siphoned off cash from their business. And not a small amount of cash, actually quite a large amount of money. And as they were trying to figure out why their GST numbers weren't balancing at the end of the year, they had an accountant look into it further, and as they started to dig through this, they realized that this employee had siphoned off a large amount of money. And so they were kind of faced with this dilemma, like, this is a family friend, this is an employee that's been with us for a while, but this is a large amount of money that they needed to recover. And so they decided that they had one of two options, and so they went to this employee with those two options, and the two options were either you pay us back this money or we go to the RCMP and then you can deal with them, and we'll go to small claims court and we'll go and do all of the legal, but if you pay us back, we'll just pretend it's all good, you no longer work for us regardless, but here are the options. And I remember at the time hearing this story, and it was really heartbreaking because their child was sick, and they admitted that they lost a little bit of oversight over their business because they were focused on other things. And it's clear, the Minister of Industry has even said, and I quote, "did not sufficiently monitor the contracts." Well, that's his job. That's the minister's job, is to make sure that government's money is actually being spent properly. And so he doesn't have the excuse of a sick kid taking over his contract and his ability to not do his job. He's been in this job. This was his responsibility. And the government, the NDP Liberal government, continues to put up all these different arguments of how we're somehow violating charter rights, and that somehow rights of people to misappropriate government money and Liberal insiders getting rich is worth more than the constitutional rights conferred on Parliament by to be able to have these documents. And we've now seen this multiple times after 9 years of this Liberal-NDP government. The list of scandals, as many of my colleagues have listed off, is large. There's so many scandals at this point, it is hard to keep it straight. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to get into a space that I think is really important here. It doesn't matter what happened. They now know that people got rich and got money through conflicts of interest that they shouldn't have had, and they refuse to provide documents to the RCMP. They are the employers. And this is perhaps the ideological difference between Conservatives and Liberals. We believe that every single person that works for the Government of Canada or a subsidiary of the Government of Canada is an employee of the Canadian people. And therefore, as the representatives of the Canadian people, when Parliament makes a vote and decides that we need to bring this, to have these documents to send to the RCMP, we are acting on behalf of the employer, the government of Canada is acting on behalf of the employer, which are the Canadian people. And it appears that the Liberal, they believe that the employer is the Liberal Party of Canada, and that unless the Liberal Party of Canada says it's okay, they're going to continue to blockade these documents from being released. And they did release some of them, though. That's the interesting part of this. So the production order was a whole list of documents, and they complied with a part of it, but they heavily redacted. So they effectively took a big black permanent marker and crossed out large sections. And as every single different argument has been put forward by the government, it has become clear, like I'm assuming I have some understanding as to possibly what's right and what's wrong, but the reality is they're hiding. And like any parent will say, the most nervous you get as a parent is when your child goes quiet and they hide. Because you know that there's going to be possibly a good answer, but 99% of the time it's going to be something really bad. Or something that is going to require a lot of cleanup. And what this government is doing by just blocking and refusing to comply with this order shows that they're afraid of what those results are. They're the only ones that know what those unredacted documents look like. And if they thought that they were okay and that there was no problem, they would just turn it over to the RCMP. We're not saying, give me, the Member of Parliament from Fort McMurray Cold Lake, these documents that have potentially personnel information and private information. We're not saying hand it over to every single parliamentarian. We are asking to have them unredacted sent to the RCMP so that if there is a problem, the RCMP has all of the available information and can look into it and potentially go after that. That is the crux of this issue. And so the fact that they continue to fight, like, why is this the problem? And there are the Auditor General themselves found that this government has turned this into a complete and total slush fund, and that there was $58 million to 10 ineligible projects that couldn't demonstrate an environmental benefit or development of any green technology. So that's $58 million to like completely uneligible projects that were connected to Liberals. Then there was another $334 million over 186 cases to projects which board members held a conflict of interest. So $334 million, 186 cases where groups that had conflicts of interest got money. And there was a $58 million to projects that didn't ensure contribution agreements and terms were met. This is not just incompetence. This is negligence. This is approaching fraud, if it isn't already at fraud. Like this is very troubling. And we have Canadians right now, Mr. Speaker, that are lining up at food banks, that are having a hard time putting groceries in their shopping carts and then putting food on the table to feed their families. We have families that have never thought they would need a food bank, lining up at food banks and having to eat that piece of humble pie so that their children get meals. We have people that are skipping meals in Canada because of the out-of-control inflation, the out-of-control interest rates, because of after 9 years of this Liberal-NDP government, everything has become broken. Their out-of-control spending has led to ever-increasing inflation. And it's really interesting because I think often about inflation because my dad used to talk about how things were so inexpensive when he was little. And basically my entire childhood, a chocolate bar was the same price from when I was like 4 years old than when I remember going to the grocery store and getting a chocolate bar or a convenience store, to when I was an adult and 16 years old working in a convenience store for the first time, and the price of the chocolate bar hadn't really increased in price. So when my dad used to talk all the time about like, this used to cost 25 cents when I was a kid, it made me think that he was really, really old. Only to realize that no, he lived through wild inflationary times and out of control interest rates that impacted the cost of living for his generation and made it really difficult for people in his generation to initially buy a house. In fact, when my dad went to go buy his very first house, I think he told me that interest rates were like 18%. So instead, he was lucky, and that was because of Pierre Trudeau Sr. and those fiscal policies. But it made it so that my dad, who was lucky that he had a good job in Fort McMurray and managed to save money while renting a house until he could pay cash for a house, which is something that today no one can even imagine as feasible because the cost of living is so high. Most young people today don't even see themselves being able to save up enough money to get a down payment on a house. And that's because of the absolute train wreck fiscal policies from this Liberal-NDP government. And time again, they continue to fail Canadians. They continue to do their job. Their job is to look out for Canadians' best interest. And yet, here we have yet another example of extreme incompetence or worse. And when we have a minister who did not sufficiently monitor contracts that were given to Liberal insiders, I choose to really question whether they're really being serious about what their job is. And Mr. Speaker, we've been really clear on this side. And I believe every single one of these Conservative speeches is just release the documents to the RCMP and we can go back to our next piece of business here. The fact that they continue to blockade any possibility of this moving forward is part of the problem. And we've had so many whistleblowers come forward. This wasn't like the government found this because the government's audits found this. This was found because of a whole bunch of whistleblowers and the work of my colleague from South Shore St. Margaret's and his diligent work going through the books. And this is the part that really is frustrating to a lot of Canadians, is to them, $334 million and 186 different cases of conflict of interest should be enough to stop everything. But with this government, it is just enough for them to keep going and think that they're going to pat themselves on the back for all of these successes that they've had, because you know what, if you just taxed people a little bit more, we would stop forest fires. And if you just did a little bit more, that somehow everything would get better. Well, Canadians know that the way how we're going to make life better is having a carbon tax election and electing a common sense Conservative government who can get our economy back on track. Because, Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, Canadians have had more than enough of this NDP-Liberal government spending their children and grandchildren's future into absolute poverty. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am very proud to be here today as a member of His Majesty's loyal opposition, a position that means we hold the government to account. We are not oppositional for the sake of opposition. We are charged through our parliamentary system with holding the government accountable for their actions. And right now, they aren't showing any accountability, they aren't showing any transparency, and they aren't showing Canadians the work they deserve. So, Mr. Speaker, myself and many of my colleagues will continue the charge to hold this government accountable on this failed policy and these failed spaces.
Resuming debate, the honourable for Fort McMurray Cold Lake has 6 minutes remaining in the debate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is an honour to come in here and finish my speech from earlier today. As has been described, effectively what's happened after 9 years of this NDP-Liberal government, they've completely lost the plot. There has been scandal after scandal after scandal, and the Auditor General of Canada has continually found that there have been all kinds of misgivings in terms of spending and any kind of compliance. In fact, the Sustainable Development Technology Canada, SDTC, turned into a slush fund for Liberal insiders And we've been hearing from a variety of different whistleblowers of just how bad this is. In fact, one SDTC whistleblower said, and I quote, "Just as I was always confident that the Auditor General would confirm the financial mismanagement in SDTC, I remain equally confident that the RCMP will substantiate the criminal activities that occurred within the organization." Another whistleblower, and I quote, "The true failure of this situation stands at the feet of our current government, whose decision to protect wrongdoers and cover up the findings over the last 12 months is a serious indictment of how our democratic systems and institutions are being corrupted by political interference. It should never have taken 2 years for the issues to reach this point, and what should have been a straightforward process turned into a bureaucratic nightmare that allowed SDTC to continue wasting millions of dollars and abusing countless employees over the last year." These are exceptionally troubling. And this isn't the first time this Parliament has had to have conversations that are very serious in nature over this government trying to cover up scandal. And one of the parts that I actually am quite frustrated with when it comes to this particular piece is the number of conflicts of interest where it was Liberal insiders that were getting money. And in fact, the Minister of Environment, who prior to joining Cabinet served as a strategic advisor for a venture capital firm called Cycle Capital from 2009 to 2018. So it wasn't a short period of time that he was this strategic advisor. This same person, who is now the Minister of Environment, the person that the Prime Minister has entrusted to handle Parks Canada, which we've seen being an absolute failure in terms of what's happened in Jasper, where they were either completely incompetent or negligent, and let 30% of the homes in that community burn as a direct result of their mismanagement. But he still has shares in this Cycle Capital company, which is kind of interesting, and this exact company actually got money from this green slush fund. So it just continues showing the number of conflicts of interest, and this is where this becomes a serious problem. We have Canadians that are struggling to make ends meet. We have Canadians that are struggling to put food on their table. We're approaching Thanksgiving, and yet there are Canadians in Jasper. There are people in Jasper, 30% of the people in Jasper, their homes are gone. And this government, this NDP-Liberal government, sat on their hands for the last 9 years having forest mismanagement because they failed to accept that the pine beetle was a real threat. There are emails, there is correspondence that went back and forth as to whether they should consider the political optics of prescribed burns. They completely neglected forest management. And then to add insult to injury, they turned away fire trucks, they turned away firefighters that were there ready, willing to help. They also, interestingly enough, decided to install fire hydrants in the town site of Jasper that actually weren't compatible with the majority of the fire trucks, actually the fire trucks that are in Alberta and British Columbia, which seems like a total miss, because that basically means that you are very limited in the amount of outside help you can actually even get. And that's because Parks Canada doesn't actually understand the Western Canadian perspective. But I digress here. And this is the problem, is that this government has completely lost the plot. They continue to funnel money into the Liberal insiders, giving them almost a blank check to mismanage Canadian funds, and yet put real people at risk day in, day out. And Madam Speaker, it is exceptionally clear that Canadians have had enough. Every single weekend when I go home to my riding of Fort McMurray Cold Lake, I hear from people that tell me, we just need an election. When are we going to have an election? We can't handle the pressure any longer of the mismanagement from this NDP Liberal government, their waste, their corruption, their chaos. They see crime rising at an ever-increasing rate as a direct result of the catch and release bail policies this government pats themselves on the back for bringing forward. They are currently fighting this and preventing documents from going to the RCMP because they are afraid of what's in the documents. They make arguments that this is about charter rights, ignoring the fact that the Parliament of Canada has the right to have these. The Speaker has ruled very clearly that these documents were not to be redacted, and yet What we received was redacted documents, and so, Madam Speaker, it is very clear that this has to go to the RCMP. These documents have to go completely unredacted to the RCMP. Canadians deserve it.